Specific closure effects. Though no specific evidence in the matter seems to exist, the need for a specific closure should increase the magnitude of primacy effects if the early information was congruent with the perceiver's salient motivation. Under such circumstances, the perceiver should seize and freeze on the pleasing judgments that such information affords, and pay less attention, and/or give less weight to, subsequent information. All to the contrary, if the early information was undesirable or incongruent with one's goal, the individual may be motivated to search further. Ditto and Lopez, 1992. Ditto et al., 1993, and hence be less prone to exhibit the primacy effect. Imagine a parent at a PTA meeting receiving information about how his child has done during the preceding semester, or a worker receiving feedback from a supervisor about his performance on the job. According to the present hypothesis, if such early information was positive, the individual may use it as a basis for his overall judgment. The parent may conclude his child has done rather well and tend to underestimate the importance and/or relevance of the subsequent, less positive, information. Similarly, the worker may feel that his boss is rather pleased with his performance and tend to minimize the significance of the subsequent, less glowing part of the evaluation. By contrast, if the initial information was negative, the subsequent information may be attended to much more carefully and systematically. Especially if the evaluative implications of such information were positive or agreeable, they may color one's overall judgment disproportionately and drown out the impression left by the initial, less sanguine information. In addition, an intriguing asymmetry may exist between attention accorded the desirable and the undesirable information as a function of their relative ordinal position. The positive information may be paid considerable attention both if it preceded the negative information and if it followed it. By contrast, the negative information may be paid considerably greater attention when it preceded the positive information than when it followed it. The reason is that after receiving the desirable information, the individual may freeze on the judgment it implies and refrain from considering the subsequent undesirable information. By contrast, if the negative information came first, the individual would continue processing information in the hope of overturning its undesirable implications, and would therefore attentively consider the subsequent desirable information. Anchoring effects. An important feature of the seizing and freezing effects is that they may characterize quite disparate social cognitive phenomena, which superficially have little relationship with one another. For instance, the primacy effects may seem rather unrelated to a famous judgmental phenomenon known as the anchoring effect, Tversky and Kahneman, 1974, Strack and Musweiler, 1997. An anchoring effect occurs in situations where individuals are asked to render a numerical estimate of some kind, for example, to estimate the percentage of African nations within the UN, the length of the Yangtze River, or the average annual rainfall in Brazil. At issue here are judgments rendered under uncertainty rather than ones involving the retrieval of well-known, hence, subjectively certain, facts. In such circumstances, casual exposure to some seemingly irrelevant number in the context of a prior comparative question, e.g., is the percentage of the African nations in the UN less or more than X? Has been known to bias the final or absolute estimate in the direction of that number. Thus, if that anchor, yielded, e.g., by a spin of a roulette wheel, was high, e.g., 95%, the percentage of African members estimated to exist within the UN would be estimated as relatively high, say, 45%. By contrast, if the initial, and seemingly arbitrary, anchor was low, e.g., 15%, the absolute percent estimate would be relatively low, say, 24%. From the present perspective, the anchoring effect represents the seizing and freezing on an initial knowledge activated, and hence made accessible, by the anchor. A similar perspective is featured by Strack and Musweiler, 1997, in a recent analysis. In line with other accessibility effects, These investigators found that target knowledge activated by the anchor is used toward the rendition of judgments primarily if it is perceived as applicable to the judgment. For instance, if the anchor concerns length and the judgment concerns width, the anchoring effect is much attenuated. Similarly, where the original stimulus compared with the anchor was similar to the stimulus about which the absolute judgment was being rendered, e.g., participants indicated whether the mean winter temperature in the Antarctic was higher or lower than -50 degrees centigrade, and then had to estimate the mean winter temperature in the Antarctic, assimilation to the anchor was found to occur. However, if the two stimuli were different, i.e., after being asked the first question about the Antarctic, the second question involved an estimation of the mean temperature in Hawaii, a contrast from the anchor was found. Perhaps the most compelling evidence that the anchoring effect involves the use of activated knowledge was the finding that where the anchor was totally implausible, the latency of answering the first comparative question was shorter than where the anchor was plausible. However, in such a case, the latency of answering the second, absolute question was longer. This verifies that where the anchor is plausible, but not where it is implausible, the individual engages in elaborative processing, which activates considerable knowledge. Such knowledge may subsequently facilitate and hence shorten the latency with which the respondent answers the second question. If the anchoring effect is a special case of seizing and freezing upon plausible, or applicable, activated knowledge, it should be appropriately augmented by a heightened need for closure. We submitted this idea to Empirical Test, Kruglanski and Freund, 1983, Study 3. To that end, we used a paradigm developed by Meyer-Bar-Hillel, 1973, requiring participants to choose within pairs of events the one more likely to occur. Some pairs contrasted conjunctive events with simple events, while other pairs contrasted simple events with disjunctive events. A conjunctive event represents a union of several simple events with given probabilities. Hence, its probability is lower than that of its constituent events. A disjunctive event represents the exclusive occurrence of one among several possible events, e.g., the probability that on two tosses of a coin, one would obtain two heads. Accordingly, its probability is higher than that of any of its constitutive events, e.g., the probability that on a throw of a die, its upper face will show either a 3 or a 2. According to Bar-Hillel, 1973, participants start the process with the probability of a constituent event. This provides a plausible, in the ballpark, anchor that participants then adjust upward, for disjunctive events, or downward, for conjunctive events. However, the adjustment is often insufficient, Tversky and Kahneman, 1974. This results in an underestimation of the probabilities of disjunctive events and an overestimation of the probabilities of conjunctive events. Such adjustment should be particularly limited under a heightened need for closure. In our study, participants judged the probabilities of conjunctive and disjunctive events either under time pressure, assumed to elevate the need for closure, or without time pressure, and were either given or not given accountability instructions, assumed to lower the need for closure. As predicted, time pressure generally increased, and the accountability instructions decreased, the degree to which participants underestimated the likelihood of disjunctive events and overestimated the likelihood of conjunctive events. It should be noted that need for closure effects should be considerably reduced if the anchor was in the implausible range, Strack and Musweiler, 1997, for that particular judgmental domain. In such a case, there should be little elaborative activity to begin with, hence little generated knowledge that could be seized and frozen upon by the need for closure. Specific closure effects. I know of no specific research that investigated the valence of the anchor in relation to its capacity to exert impact on subsequent estimates. Yet, if the anchor indeed represents or fosters the generation of an initial, plausible, hypothesis that may be seized or frozen upon, it might do so in part as a function of its desirability. Imagine an individual estimating the number of engineers in a given town. Suppose further that this estimator was herself an engineer, and was contemplating relocation to the town in question. In as far as our individual might well be interested in finding employment, it would be to her clear advantage if the number of engineers was low, implying lower competition and higher demand for engineers, rather than high. If our analysis is correct, the impact of a low, hence, motivationally desirable, anchor on the final estimate should be more pronounced than the impact of a high, and motivationally undesirable, anchor. The correspondence bias, a phenomenon that held particular fascination for social psychologists over the last 3 decades, is known as the correspondence bias, Jones, 1979, or the fundamental attribution error, Ross, 1977. It refers to the attributor's tendency to over-ascribe an actor's behavior to his unique attitudes or personality, and underestimate the power of the situation capable of eliciting such behavior from most people. The effect was originally demonstrated in a study by Jones and Harris, 1967, that required participants to judge the true attitude of a target person after reading an opinion essay allegedly prepared by this individual under either free choice or under no choice conditions. The intriguing finding was that even when participants learned that the target was given no choice in determining the contents of the essay, and was explicitly instructed by the experimenter to espouse a given position, they still estimated that her attitude corresponded to some degree to the one expressed in the essay. Various theorists, e.g., Jones, 1979, Quattrone, 1982, Gilbert, Pelham, and Krull, 1988, speculated about the possible role that the anchoring and insufficient adjustment process may play in this particular bias. Specifically, when participants are asked to judge the target's true attitude, the most salient piece of evidence available to them is the behavior that has just occurred, i.e., the opinion endorsed in the essay. This may directly bring to mind the assumption that the behavior corresponds to the writer's authentic attitude. This initial hypothesis may serve as a kind of anchor that is subsequently adjusted in the course of a deliberative process that involves the consideration of some less salient, yet highly relevant, evidence, namely, that the behavior was situationally constrained. Because such an adjustment typically is insufficient, Tversky and Kahneman, 1974, the final attitude attribution would be biased in the direction of the anchor, i.e., the initial attitudinal hypothesis. It seems plausible that such a deliberative adjustment process may require substantial cognitive resources and effort. Indeed, evidence suggests that the correspondence bias is substantially greater when the individual's cognitive capabilities are reduced. Gilbert, Pelham, and Krull, 1988. If adjustment requires significant cognitive effort, however, it should also be appropriately affected by the motivation to expend the effort. Evidence to that effect was adduced by TEDTalk, 1985, who found that the correspondence bias was reduced substantially when participants were made to feel accountable for their judgments. It seems, then, that accountability concerns may motivate participants to become more active in discriminating as information processes, leading to greater adjustment of the initial hypothesis and lowering the degree to which the final judgments tend to be anchored on it. Now, as noted earlier, accountability, accuracy, evaluation, apprehension, etc. Instructions may evoke in participants a fear of invalidity that may lower their need for closure. Similarly, a reduction in cognitive capability, Gilbert et al., 1988, may elevate such a need as it increases the laboriousness of information processing that would render the possession of closure advantageous. In short, just as with the primacy and anchoring effects discussed earlier, the correspondence bias may reflect the seizing and freezing on early hypotheses affected by the need for closure. This possibility was tested in a series of experiments by Webster, 1993. Participants completed a typical attitude attribution task in which they estimated a target's attitude after hearing her deliver a speech criticizing student exchange programs with foreign universities. The speech was allegedly prepared under high or low choice conditions. The need for closure was manipulated via perceived task attractiveness. Specify Cali. Perceptions of the attitude attribution task were varied by comparing this initial task to a subsequent task our participants were expecting to perform. In some conditions, this subsequent task, watching a new comedy video, was presented in glowing colors and was expected to be highly appealing. This made the initial attitude attribution task seem unattractive by comparison. In other conditions, the subsequent task, watching a video of a lecture on multivariate statistics, was expected to be rather unappealing, which rendered the initial task attractive by comparison. Finally, in a control condition, the subsequent task was portrayed as very similar to the initial one, leading participants to perceive it as of the same, moderate, attractiveness. Appropriate manipulation checks, e.g., items inquiring how important it was for participants to render a judgment quickly, and once inquiring into participants' felt confidence with respect to their judgments, showed that these task attractiveness conditions were successful in producing the corresponding differences in the need for closure. Thus, the need for closure was highest in the unattractive task condition, lowest in the attractive task condition, and intermediate in the neutral control condition. More importantly, the correspondence bias appeared to be influenced by the need for closure in the expected manner. This bias was enhanced in the unattractive task condition relative to the control condition and reduced in the attractive task condition relative to the control condition. These results were replicated in a second study, where need for closure was operationally defined via scores on the need for closure scale, Webster and Kruglansky, 1994. Of particular interest, in a third study the pattern of results was completely reversed when initial cues implied a situational rather than an attitudinal attribution. In that study, attributors again read a negative essay on student exchange programs, allegedly authored by a participant in a prior research study. The description of the attributor's task made highly accessible the hypothesis that the target's essay writing was strongly influenced by the situation. To achieve that effect, the experiment was alleged to study the psychological experience of serving as a participant in an experiment. The putative objective was to develop methods of minimizing experimental error leading to invalid data. Specifically, participants were informed that because of a desire to gain a positive evaluation from the experimenter, some individuals might respond to subtle cues conveyed by her or him as to the appropriate ways to behave. The participant's task was to determine whether the target's behavior, of essay writing, was possibly the result of such situational pressures. As in Webster's prior two experiments, the need for closure was manipulated via task attractiveness. Prior to reading the target's essay, participants reviewed an attitude survey the target had allegedly completed, which indicated that her opinion of student exchange programs was negative, congruent with the position espoused in the essay, positive, incongruent with the essay, or neutral, neither congruent nor incongruent. Participants then read the essay and responded to measures of the dependent variables. No differences due to task attractiveness appeared where the participant's attitude was incongruent with the essay. In that condition, the position espoused in the essay was predominantly ascribed to the situational influence, i.e., the experimenter's subtle cues. However, where the target's alleged attitude was congruent with the essay, and hence capable of providing a perfectly plausible explanation of the writer's position, task attractiveness did make a substantial difference. Specifically, where the task was unattractive and hence likely to instill a relatively high degree of the need for closure, participants tended to attribute the essay's position to the situation more than participants in the neutral position who, in turn, attributed it to the situation more than participants in the task attractive condition. Moreover, these differences were mediated by differences in need for closure, assessed via the appropriate manipulation checks. Cultural differences in lay explanations. Reactions to conflict, and self-presentation. Strategies. Lay explanations. The above findings suggest that whether a dispositional or a situational attribution will be made depends jointly on the accessibility of a given attributional hypothesis and on the need for closure. In contexts where a dispositional hypothesis is particularly accessible, persons under a heightened need for closure will be more likely to make a dispositional attribution than their low need for closure counterparts, and in contexts where a situational hypothesis is accessible, high versus low need for closure individuals will be more likely to make a situational attribution. Recently, Chu, Hong, Menon, and Morris, 1999, examined the cross-cultural implications of this analysis. In prior work, these investigators found that as compared to Chinese subjects, North Americans tend more to explain social behaviors in terms of individual dispositions. By contrast, the Chinese more so than the North Americans tend to explain social behaviors in terms of the group's dispositions. Chu et al., 1999, reasoned that the North American cultural context primes, hence, renders accessible, the individual disposition hypothesis as an explanatory construct for social behavior, whereas the Chinese cultural context primes the group disposition hypothesis. If it is true that under heightened need for closure individuals tend to seize and freeze on any accessible hypothesis, it follows that high versus low need for closure Chinese should be more likely to make attributions to group dispositions, whereas high versus low need for closure North Americans should be more likely to make attributions to individual dispositions. Chu et al., 1999, investigated these possibilities in 3 separate studies. The first of these replicated the basic finding of Menon, Morris, Chu, and Hong. 1998, that Hong Kong Chinese have a greater propensity to attribute social events to group rather than individual dispositions. A noteworthy feature of this replication was that rather than using vignettes, as in the Menon et al.'s 1998 work, participants reacted to descriptions of real-life events that have occurred in Hong Kong and had to do with pharmaceutical errors with adverse health consequences for the patients. The second study assessed US and Hong Kong participants' need for closure via the English version of the Need for Closure Scale, Webster and Kruglanski, 1994, or its Chinese translation, Lam, Lau, and Chu, 1998. The participants were ethnic Chinese recruited at a subway or train station in Hong Kong and non-Asian Americans encountered in the waiting area of a San Francisco domestic airport. They were presented a description of one of the pharmaceutical errors used in the first study, whereby mouthwash erroneously given as a fever medicine to children made many of them sick. Participants then responded to various attributional items, half of which depicted individual dispositional causes, e.g., the assistant is incompetent, the assistant is neglectful, and the other half, group dispositional causes, e.g., the clinic is incompetent in maintaining the proper use of medical products, or the clinic has poor management. As predicted, among Chinese participants the NFCS scores correlated positively with group dispositional attributions, and did not correlate significantly with individual dispositional attributions. By contrast, among American participants, there was a marginally significant positive correlation between NFCS and individual dispositional attributions and an insignificant negative correlation between the NFCS and group dispositional attributions. The third study returned to the vignette format and manipulated the need for closure via time pressure, Kruglanski and Freund, 1983. Chinese and American participants were presented with a vignette about cattle escaping from an enclosed area and hitting a farmer. This information was presented in 2 forms, one where the agent was an individual, a specific bull that broke away, the other where the agent was a group, the entire herd broke away. No culture or agent effects were found under low time pressure. Under high time pressure, however, Chinese participants made significantly stronger dispositional attributions when the agent was the group, whereas the American participants made significantly stronger dispositional attributions when the agent was the individual. Conflict resolution strategies. Fu, Morris, Lee, Chu, and Hong, 2003. Investigated need for closure effects on preferred conflict resolution strategies of Hong Kong Chinese versus European Americans. Prior research has found that as compared with the Chinese, Americans have stronger preference for competitive over accommodating conflict management styles, Trubinsky, Ting Toomey, and Lin 1991. In their first study, Fu et al. 2003, replicated this difference using Rahim's 1983 conflict management style scale, but also found that it was significantly amplified by the need for closure assessed via the original or translated versions of the Webster-on-Kruglansky 1994 scale. In their second study, Fu et al. 2003, investigated need for closure effects on another feature previously shown to separate Chinese versus American approaches to conflict resolution, the kind of mediation preferred by members of the two cultures. Prior, Le Richer, 1992, work has indicated that whereas the Chinese prefer a mediator who is known and respected by both parties, the Americans prefer a stranger, assuming such individual to be capable of greater objectivity, and hence fairness in her or his approach to mediation. Fu et al. 2003, proceeded to test these notions via a vignette study portraying a workplace conflict in which two disputants argued about the origin attribution, and hence the accreditation, of an award-winning marketing scheme. Both disputants apparently agreed to mediation, but the question was what kind of mediation would they prefer. Participants were asked to put themselves in the disputants' shoes and to select their most preferred mediation type. Specifically, they were given the descriptions of 4 possible mediators, 2 of whom were well known to both disputants and respected by both, whereas the remaining 2 were unknown to either disputant. The statistical interaction between culture, need for closure, and mediator type was significant. High need for closure Americans significantly preferred the unfamiliar mediator rather than the familiar one, whereas high need for closure Chinese exhibited a significant opposite pattern of preferences. Among low need for closure participants, there were no significant cultural differences on mediator choice. Self-presentation strategies. Another potential dimension of cultural differences between the Chinese and the Americans relates to their strategies of self-presentation. These differential strategies correspond to Paulu's 1998 dual-mode framework of self-presentation, including self-deceptive enhancement (SDE) and impression management (IM). Lalwani, Shavit, Johnson, and Zhang, 2003, recently reported that individualists, an orientation typical of Americans and other Westerners, tend to present a positive self by the former mode, SDE, whereas collectivists, an orientation typical of the Chinese and other Asians, tend to do so via the latter mode, IM. In a recent study, Chu, Ip, and Chen, 2003, found that the need for closure, assessed via the Webster and Kruglansky 1994 scale, moderated these differences for both Hong Kong Chinese and American participants. Specifically, whereas high need for closure American participants significantly preferred the SDE strategy over the IM strategy, and the high need for closure Chinese significantly preferred the IM strategy over the SDE strategy, these differences effectively disappeared for low need for closure Americans and Chinese. Reward allocation. Fu, Lee, Chu, Morris, and Hong, 2003, investigated cultural differences in the perceptions of reward allocation procedures. Equity and equality allocational rules were presented via the appropriate scenarios. These scenarios depicted 2 co-workers, Alex and Pat, who collaborated on designing a new signaling system for a railway. In all conditions, Pat has done 2 times more work on the project than Alex. In one condition, Pat, who was generally assigned the task of allocating the cash bonus the 2 workers received for their work, uses the equity rule to divide the money. In another condition, Pat employs the equality rule to do so. Participants, Hong Kong Chinese or Americans, were asked to rate the fairness of this procedure. The time it took them to respond to this measure was assessed. It turned out that participants who responded relatively quickly, attesting that they may have been under a high need for closure, demonstrated significant differences in perceived fairness of the allocational procedure consistent with their cultural norms. The Chinese rated the egalitarian procedure as fairer than the equity-based procedure, whereas the Americans rated the equity-based procedure as more fair. Participants who responded relatively slowly, attesting to a low need for closure, did not show culturally consistent preferences among allocational procedures. These findings were replicated in a second study in which the need for closure was measured via the Webster and Kruglanski, 1994, scale, and where the participants were all Hong Kong Chinese, in whom either the Chinese or the Western cultural norms were primed via cultural icons. Participants who scored high on the need for closure measure, but not those scoring low on this measure, evinced culturally consistent preferences. Those exposed to the Chinese prime preferred the equality-based procedure over the equity-based one, whereas those exposed to the American prime displayed the exact opposite preference pattern. Taken as a body, findings reviewed in this section support the present analysis that need for closure effects are essentially content-free, and that they depend on whatever inferential rules or cues are momentarily or chronically accessible. From that perspective, the need for closure was shown capable of magnifying the tendencies to render a wide variety of inferences, including situational, group, or personal attributions, positive versus negative impressions, etc. Of particular interest, the need for closure was shown to amplify the adherence to cultural norms, beliefs, and procedures across cultures as different in their contents as are those of the Americans and the Chinese. Of course, differences in belief systems may exist within cultures as well, and not only between cultures. For instance, members of the same culture may subscribe to distinct political ideologies, and as illustrated in a later chapter, the need for closure may moderate the extent of also those ideological differences. Specific closure effects. How might the phenomena above be affected by the motivational desirability of specific closures? Take the correspondence bias. The critical variable should be, again, the extent to which the correspondence hypothesis was desirable or undesirable to the individual. Imagine a target person who, under considerable external pressure, expressed a public support for a given political candidate. To a supporter of that politician, the correspondence hypothesis, that this is the target's true opinion, would be highly desirable, and hence she would be unlikely to discount it. On the other hand, the politician's adversary may be reluctant to accept that hypothesis and be rather quick to notice the duress under which the target's support was elicited. Or to take a currently salient example, consider the attributions made by various parties for President George W. Bush's administration's decision to launch a war on Iraq. From the present perspective, opponents of this administration, motivated to reach the specific closure that the administration was scheming and sinister in its aims, may well question the supposition that the readiness to go to war reflected the administration's genuine attitudes and concern about the danger posed by Saddam Hussein, and instead attribute it to various ulterior motives such as the U.S. economic interest in Iraq's oil fields. Supporters of the administration, on the other hand, motivated to reach a benign attribution, may take its pronouncements at face value and accept that its readiness to war reflects deep-seated values and ideological convictions. Research by Ditto, Sipansky, Monroe, Apanovich, and Lockhart, 1998, Study 1, tested empirically the hypothesis that preference consists tend dispositional inferences, that is, desired closures, will reveal the insensitivity to situational constraint information resulting in the typical correspondence bias, Jones, 1979. By contrast, Preference inconsistent information relevant to dispositional inferences will evoke sensitivity to situational constraints and initiate a more effortful cognitive appraisal. Male participants were given favorable or unfavorable evaluations by another alleged participant, a female accomplice. Half the participants were told the evaluator had been free to write whatever she desired, whereas the other half were informed that she had been instructed to write on the participants' most desirable or undesirable features. The results revealed an intriguing asymmetry in participants' sensitivity to the situational constraint information driven by the degree to which the target's alleged impressions were desirable or undesirable for the participants. Those among them who received the positive evaluation tended to infer that the evaluator had a positive impression of them, and they made that inference irrespective of whether the evaluator was or was not under a situational constraint to render a positive evaluation. A very different picture emerged when the evaluation was negative. When the evaluation was made in the absence of constraints, i.e., where the evaluator was given free hand as to what to write, her true impression was perceived to be quite negative. However, when the evaluator was explicitly instructed to focus on negative features, participants perceived her true impression of themselves as significantly less negative. Ditto et al. 1998 replicated the foregoing study, adding, for half the participants a cognitive load manipulation introduced by a separate letter counting task they had to perform while reading the evaluator's impression statement. The results in the no-load condition replicated those of the prior experiment. Participants given the positive impression perceived the evaluator's true judgment of them as equally positive irrespective of whether she was or was not subjected to a situational constraint or focus on the participant's positive characteristics. Participants in the negative impression condition, however, paid attention to the constraint and perceived the evaluator's judgment as less negative in the constraint versus the free choice condition. The interaction between constraint and evaluation valence disappeared, however, where the participants were subjected to the cognitive load. In that situation, their inferences of the evaluator's opinion of them was positive in the positive feedback condition and negative in the negative feedback condition, suggesting that the increased motivation to process further information in the preference inconsistent, i.e., the negative feedback condition was counteracted by the decrease in cognitive capacity occasioned by the cognitive load. Specific closure effects may manifest themselves in tendencies to adopt or reject culturally prescribed interpretations, strategies, and procedures. Thus, the desire to be accepted by a group of cultural loyalists may increase one's tendency to embrace the norms of one's culture, whereas a desire to gain acceptance to a society of foreigners may decrease such a tendency. For instance, the desire to curry favor with the mullah's regime in contemporary Iran may increase the authentic acceptance of their cultural dictates, whereas a commitment to the secular goals of professionalism and education may instill a tendency to rebel against those norms. Similarly, the desire to gain favors from the communist regimes in the former Soviet Union, or from the fascist regime in Hitler's Germany, may foster a genuine acceptance of the social and political ideologies propagated by their representatives, whereas a motivated disidentification with these particular regimes may instill a motivation to reject their ideologies as well. Stereotype formation. The tendency to seize and freeze on salient or readily accessible information may underlie such central social psychological phenomenon as stereotype formation. Schaller, Boyd, Johann, and O'Brien, 1995, investigated this possibility in a study that assessed the need for closure via the personal need for structure measure introduced by Neuberg and Nuzum, 1993, and referred to earlier. For a fuller discussion of this particular measure, see Kruglanski et al., 1997. Participants were presented with information about two fictitious groups, A and B, whose members' intelligence was presumably assessed via an anagram task. Participants were given information about the outcome, success or failure, of a given member's attempt, identified such member as belonging to Group A or B, presented the actual anagram that contained either 5 letters, e.g., DLABE, or 7 letters, e.g., YOCNEOM, and gave the correct solution of the anagram, e.g., blade, economy. The critical feature of this procedure was that the proportion of 5 to 7 letter anagrams was not exactly the same for the two groups. Group A members attempted only 5 anagrams that were 5 letters long and 20 that were 7 letters long. Group B members had these proportions reversed, as their anagram set included 20 that were 5 letters long and 5 that were 7 letters long. The outcome information indicated that Group A members solved all 5 5-letter anagrams and 5 of 27-letter anagrams. Group B, on the other hand, solved 15 of the 25-letter anagrams, i.e., 75%, and none of the 5 7-letter anagrams. Schaller et al., 1995, argued that, although Group A had a higher success ratio on both 5-letter and 7-letter anagrams, Group B solved more total anagrams. Schaller et al., 1995, page 546. Assuming that the total number of anagrams solved represents a highly accessible bit of evidence for the group's putative intelligence, and assuming that persons under high need for closure are likely to seize and freeze on such evidence and integrate it less with the less salient and more difficult to figure constraint information about length of the anagrams and relative success rate, they should decide that members of Group B are more intelligent than those of Group A, whereas a fuller analysis would reveal the opposite to be the case. This is precisely what was found. Participants falling below the median on PNS, i.e., persons with relatively low need for closure, formed accurate judgments and concluded that Group A was more intelligent than Group B. Those falling above the PNS median, those high on the need for closure, however, reached the opposite erroneous conclusion that Group B was the more intelligent of the two. Schaller et al., 1995, replicated these results in a second study wherein, addition to need for closure assessment, accountability manipulation was introduced for some participants by leading them to believe they would have to explain and justify their judgments to another participant. From the present perspective, accountability instructions may arouse a fear of invalidity that may lower the individual's need for closure. Cf. Kruglan. Ski and Freund, 1983. Consistent with this analysis, Schaller et al., 1995, concluded that, at least on some measures, situationally induced accountability concerns did moderate the impact of PNS on the stereotype formation process, page 550. Stereotype application. On the 2nd of February 1999, an unarmed West African immigrant with no criminal record was killed by 4 New York City police officers, who fired 41 shots at him in the doorway of his Bronx apartment building. It is not entirely clear what brought about this tragic incident, but a strong possibility is that application of an aggressive African American stereotype under high need for closure played a significant part in the quickly unfolding events that led to the shooting. It was 12:45 a.m. The street was poorly lit, and the black man, Mr. Diallo, was loitering in the vestibule of the apartment, acting suspicious. The darkness may have rendered careful information processing difficult. Also, the police officers may well have been quite fatigued at that late hour, contributing to the costliness of information processing and elevating their need for closure. What business might a black man have acting suspiciously at almost 1 in the morning? The first, stereotypic, idea that probably popped into the officers' minds was that it was surely an illegal business, and a dangerous one at that. If so, time was of the essence because a failure to act might be expected to result in tragic consequences for the policemen involved. Fatigue, costliness of information processing, and subjective time pressure might have conspired to produce a highly elevated need for cognitive closure in these individuals. Seizing and freezing on the idea that the suspect was dangerous, the policeman may have interpreted an innocent movement on the part of Mr. Diallo as a hostile gesture. One policeman may have interpreted the situation in that way and opened fire, and the rest may have accepted the social reality this action defined and followed suit. From a social psychological perspective, an increased application of prevalent social stereotypes and prejudices to various social judgments represents a particularly striking case of seizing and freezing under heightened need for closure. General stereotypes prevalent within the culture, e.g., gender or age stereotypes, or stereotypes about particular social groups, constitute knowledge structures that may readily come to mind. This implies that they may be particularly likely to serve as basis for judging such stereotyped individuals when the knower is under high versus low need for closure. This possibility was first tested in an experiment by Kruglanski and Freund, 1983, which examined the impact of ethnic stereotypes about the academic competence of Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews in Israel on the assignment of grades to students for a literary composition. The Ashkenazi Jews have their origins in Europe, and their stereotype in domains of competence and achievement is rather positive. The Sephardi Jews have their origins in the Middle East and North Africa, and their corresponding stereotype is negative. Kruglanski and Freund, 1983, had their subjects, students in a graduating class of a teacher's seminary, assign grades for a composition allegedly written by an 8th grader. All participants evaluated the same composition, but the author's name was varied. Some participants learned that his name was Blumenthal, suggesting an Ashkenazi origin, whereas other participants learned that his name was Aboutbo, suggesting a Sephardi origin. Results indicated that the Ashkenazi and Sephardi stereotypes were more likely to influence grade assignments when the evaluators were under a high need for closure, manipulated via time pressure, as compared to low need for closure, manipulated via accountability concerns. Specifically, when the writer's name was Aboutbo, the composition was generally graded much lower, 17 grade points out of 100, than when it was Blumenthal. These differences disappeared, however, when the writer's need for closure was substantially lowered by an absence of time pressure combined with the presence of evaluation apprehension. In subsequent similar research, time pressure was found to increase reliance on gender stereotypes, Jameson and Zanna, 1989. Specifically, participants known a priori to have negative stereotypes about women in management were more likely to devalue the resumes of female versus male applicants for a management position when placed under high versus low time pressure. This effect occurred even though pretesting indicated that the information presented on the male and female resumes was essentially equivalent. Those findings support the notion that the need for closure leads to reliance on pre-existing knowledge structures to the relative neglect of case-specific information. The tendency to rely on stereotypes may impact memory over and above its influence on judgment. In research directed at this possibility, Dijksterhuis, Van Nippenburg, Kruglanski, and Schaper, 1996, assessed participants' need for closure via the Dutch version of the need for closure scale, Kratilis, 1995. In one study, Dutch undergraduates were presented with behavioral information about a negatively valenced group of soccer hooligans and were asked to form an impression of this group. Participants high in the need for closure recalled relatively more stereotype-consistent information, whereas participants low in the need for closure recalled more stereotype-inconsistent information. Furthermore, participants high in the need for closure judged the target group more stereotypically and perceived it as more homogeneous compared to participants low in the need for closure. These results were replicated in a second study, where the target group was positively valued, consisting of nurses. Stereotyping and specific closure needs. Recent evidence suggests that judging persons in terms of prevalent stereotypes may be affected by the degree to which doing so may be congruent with one's needs for specific closure. For example, the motivation to reaffirm one's self-worth following a failure experience may lead one to apply a negative stereotype to another individual and thus to induce in oneself a feeling of superiority over her or him. In research conducted by Fain and Spencer, 1997, participants were exposed to a failure or a success experience and were then given an opportunity to evaluate a fictitious job applicant who either was or was not a member of a stereotyped group, i.e., was or was not Jewish. It was found that following a failure experience, participants derogated the Jewish target but not the non-Jewish one, by judging her incompetent. Following success, however, participants did not differentiate between the Jewish and non-Jewish targets, disparaging neither. In other words, the failure experience may have introduced the motivation to self-affirm, which lent the status of a desirable closure to the judgment that one is superior to another individual. Because the negative stereotype of the Jewish American princess, in this case, may quickly come to mind in response to the Jewish target, it may be seized and frozen upon by individuals whose prior failure experience might dispose them to view a negative evaluation of the target as desirable. But in the absence of such motivation, i.e., following success, the tendency to seize and freeze on the negative stereotype would be weaker and the tendency to disparage the target would essentially disappear. It is also of interest that the mere motivation to reaffirm one's self-worth after failure is not enough in the absence of accessible constructs, in the case of a non-stereotyped target, that may allow one to do so. Of course, failure experience is merely one among several possible sources of the motivation to reaffirm one's self-worth. Another such source could be awareness of one's own mortality, which according to Greenberg, Pishchinsky, Solomon, Rosenblatt, Wheater, Kirkland, et al., 1990, may induce the motivation to reaffirm one's value as an individual and boost the perceived meaningfulness of one's existence. Indeed, these investigators found that increasing one's mortality salience via a questionnaire specifically designed for that purpose increased the tendency of Christian participants to rate a Jew more negatively than another Christianon in this way to boost their perceptions of their own self-worth. A more extensive description of mortality salience research relevant to need foreclosure concerns is given in the last chapter of this volume. Recent work by Kunder and Sinclair, 1999, found further evidence that needs for specific closure may enhance the tendency to base judgments on prevalent stereotypes. These investigators report evidence that college students rated female professors who had assigned them low grades more negatively than they did male professors who had given them comparable grades. This difference disappeared when evaluating female and male professors from whom the participants received high grades. Presumably, the motivation in the former case was to maintain one's self-esteem in face of a negative evaluation, a low grade, by disparaging the evaluator. The negative female stereotype makes accessible a basis for such a disparagement on which the hurt evaluators may seize and freeze, and which is absent in the case of the male evaluators.